This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. KCM Wealth Management. A few minutes before 6 o'clock on July 25th, 2010, a 40-foot long piece of pipe broke at the other end of the world. Why should we care? The state was Michigan. The owners of the pipeline, let's hold that for a moment. What happened? 1 million U.S. gallons of crude oil spilled into the Kalamazoo River. It was estimated that the cleanup, which goes on today, 2.5 years later, that the cleanup would take about a year and that it would cost about $5 million. In fact, it was more than 10 times that and counting. The cost is now over $600 million. How did this happen? Well, at the Enbridge monitoring plant in Edmonton, Alberta, guys saw 17 hours before the pipe burst that there were signals that something bad was happening. Guess what? They played chess and cards and ignored it. In fact, the reports that followed this story said that these guys behaved like the Keystone Cops. All of this does not augur well for those of us here up north in Canada trying to decide whether or not we should be happy with a new Enbridge attempt to send crude from Alberta across to Kitimat. That's the story, and our guest is Rob Fleming, NDP MLA from Victoria, who is the NDP Environment Critic. Hello, Rob. Thanks for coming over and doing this.
Thanks for having me, David.
Yeah, that's not a good opener.
No.
So, when we have to ask ourselves, when we can send people to the moon, as we like to always posit that, can we not build pipes and tankers that aren't going to rupture and spoil the world?
It is, this is the question. And the same Enbridge executives that told the people of Michigan and the states that were serviced by that pipeline that they had world-leading safe pipeline practices, regular inspection regimes, and all of those sorts of things that they're saying to the people of British Columbia today, it's the same folks, and it's the same line that they're saying. And I think that the Michigan disaster and the job that the National Transportation Safety Board did in exposing what the culture at the company was like and how the events leading up to that spill occurred, 5 years of safety deficiencies that were known by the government, where there were compliance orders issued to the company and ignored. Those are the kinds of things that could go wrong over the proposed 1,100-kilometer route across British Columbia before it gets loaded into a proposed terminal in Kitimat, where we have never had super tankers ply those waters. In fact, we've had a 40-year parliamentary moratorium on the North Coast, on the Hecate Strait, the Dixon entrance in British Columbia. So, I mean, this is a hugely controversial project proposal in British Columbia. Understandably, British Columbians are concerned. They want to examine the claims being made by the company. They're also looking at this company's safety record. We live in the shadow of the Exxon Valdez, which happened now 25 years ago, where fishermen and towns and economies and businesses were destroyed, and Exxon Mobil fought their claims every step of the way, and most of those people have never been made whole, even though the oil company said they would be. These are the kinds of things that British Columbians are very sensitive to. We've just had the Cohen Commission talk about the viability of wild salmon, which is tremendously valuable to our culture and to our economy. Yep. Billions in annual GDP a year from that fishery resource. And we see how fragile it is. And Justice Cohen made a series of recommendations. Well, this pipeline proposal, I think most British Columbians agree, doesn't square well with protecting a sustainable fishery on our coast.
Look, you mentioned oversight right at the beginning of your comments. And one of the jobs of government, you know, there's always this constant argument about more government, less government, but certainly we can all agree that one of the jobs of government is oversight. Here in this province, we've been lax in terms of farm workers, in terms of protections for workers and living conditions. Now we have questions about immigrants from China being brought in under lousy conditions for mining and so on. But let's say that British Columbia stayed in the agreement with the federal government. We'll talk about that in a second, because your party leader, Adrian Dix, has said, no, when I'm elected premier, that's over. Let's say, so what oversights are in place, if any, from the federal government? If, let's say the federal government says, okay, Enbridge, you're on, start, and they build a pipe, and the oil starts flowing. It's, for my money as a citizen, it's not enough that Enbridge has oversight, that they have inspectors. I want to know that we've got pristine government inspectors. You know, one of the steady plots on Law and Order is that there's always a guy who's being a city official who's being bribed to look the other way.
Well, you're right. I mean, a law is only as good as its enforcement.
Exactly.
And I think British Columbians are skeptical not only of the claims that Enbridge is making, they're also skeptical about the claims that government makes. You know, it was not that long ago the Auditor General of British Columbia looked at the compliance and inspection regime of the BC Environmental Office, BC Environmental Assessment Office, and found that there was a 0% post-project completion inspection rate.
What?
In other words, there are no British Columbia officials going to inspect the claims which form the conditions of permit for, you know, whether you're talking about a mine or a resort or an energy project. 0%.
That's unbelievable.
In fact, we have a regime now of self-monitoring from the project operators. So that's not independent, and that's not something that gives people great confidence. And while the National Energy Board has been reviewing the Enbridge application, we see Mr. Harper and his party, the Conservatives in the House of Commons, doing everything they can to reduce the scientific capacity of all the various different agencies that the federal government has that work on behalf of the public, whether it's the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, whether it's the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. Deep cuts, the funding of science programs and research councils also cut. This erodes the culture of oversight and compliance. People expect government to do their job, and when you get to a situation where, you know, the statutory requirements for enforcement can't be met because we don't have the human resources in place, that's a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, you see, I'm one of these people who doesn't particularly want a government to run a car insurance company or business. I don't particularly welcome ICBC all these many years later, although we all have to admit it's done a heck of a good job. I didn't welcome Autopac in Manitoba, same thing. But what I do want is, if a government allows free enterprise to continue running businesses like that there is oversight. But if you're telling me that there's no oversight, why don't we just go the full California, Texas route and build private jails with no oversight and watch prisoners being beat up and murdered and so on with no oversight?
I think it's a concern. I mean, one of the things we learned, thanks to a journalist like Mike D'Souza, who FOI'd a number of documents, had Freedom of Information applications, was that there were disagreements between Department of Fisheries and Ocean staff and Enbridge employees, the proponents, about how to assess risk on different rivers and streams. There's 800 bodies of water that this proposed pipeline crosses in British Columbia. And in many instances...
800 bodies of water.
Yeah, including all of the great rivers of British Columbia that have salmon spawning productivity.
The mathematics, just the pure statistical mathematics, say those are not good odds. I wouldn't want to take that to Vegas.
No, and I think what DFO did is they assessed a number of these crossings for the pipeline route to be high risk. In other words, you know, an engineering challenge, but also in terms of a spill risk, that the damage done to the environment and the ecosystems around would be significant, and we had Enbridge pushing back and saying no, they were low to moderate risk instances, and they disagreed with them. And You know, I think that with the Conservatives and also the BC Liberals here, those kinds of pushbacks have too much influence, and we very rarely, the public very rarely learns about these sorts of things, because I don't think public servants are very well protected. We don't have whistleblower legislation, for example, in the province of BC, and they get their way all too often.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you another thing we've learned from the National Energy Board process just recently. When Enbridge was asked to define the world-leading safety standards that it says they will put in place on monitoring that pipeline route, they gave this idea that they had a 5-line defense system. Oh, and he actually examined, and they were cross-examined, those claims.
And one of the lines was chipmunks and other wild animals running through the forest pulling their hair out.
It was not far off.
Yeah.
I mean, they actually said that there would be walking routes along the 1,100-kilometer route. I mean, these are sparsely populated areas, unpopulated areas for much of the terrain.
Walking routes, I don't get it.
Well, they would actually have squads of people visually inspecting the pipeline, presumably year-round. I mean, give me a break. Does anybody believe that that would happen?
Well, they could get all those people who are picking up needles in the back alleys of the downtown east side, they could move them up north, and they could walk along the pipelines.
Well, this was made that this is the latest state-of-the-art technology, and then when you examine what they're actually talking about, another one was that they would have flyovers with Cessnas looking at the pipeline, visually inspecting it from the air as if that was some kind of leak detection system. I mean, it may be after a massive spill has eroded, but one would think that within the pumping stations, Enbridge would be able to determine and respond a lot sooner.
I thought they're supposed to all be, I thought the whole line is supposed to be electronically monitored. Is this just sci-fi? Because I watched 10 minutes of the last Pierce Brosnan 007 movie on TV yesterday afternoon, and that's what happened. They're all standing around, including M. They're all there, and they're going beep, 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 beep. Oh, there's a break in that pipeline.
I think British Columbians have been rather underwhelmed by what they've actually heard under sworn testimony, under cross-examination by various third parties at the National Energy Board hearings. The bottom line is the risk is huge. The economic benefit is not apparent.
It's not?
No, it's not. And you know what's interesting is that northern British Columbians, in poll after poll, are less likely to support the Enbridge Northern Gateway than people who live in the south of the province. Every region of the province has turned against this project the longer it has gone on and been examined.
The former mayor of Prince Rupert, of course, just recently had an op-ed piece in The Sun in which, of course, he supports it. I had the peculiar accident of sitting next to the mayor of Prince George at a dinner a week and a half ago. Lovely, interesting lady, very smart, very sharp. I expect her to be the premier within 8 years. And she says that as the mayor of Prince George, I don't have an opinion because it bypasses us. But as an individual, she likes it.
She likes it. Isn't it interesting, though, that Prince George City Council is quote-unquote neutral on the project?
Yes.
I mean, this would be the supply and service hub for this project. So the construction jobs, nobody can argue with. I think what British Columbians have been shocked to learn is that the Enbridge Northern Gateway in total leaves 78 permanent full-time jobs after completion.
That's it.
You know, as one councillor in Kitimat put it, we're talking about a Canadian Tire or a Safeway opening up in town. I mean, in terms of the job that would be left.
Let's just catch our breath. When we come back, I want to talk more about the politics and see if this kind of thing is really feasible, because we've had some interesting comments both from the Prime Minister and from our Premier. Our guest is Rob Fleming, NDP MLA. Critic for the environment. We're going to catch a little breather. I remind you that davidberner.com is the site to go to, and we let our friends say hello to you. These are the folks who help us bring you this program here on Shaw Community Television, Cable 4. Back in a moment. This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. KCM Wealth Management. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. So as recently as October 3rd of this year, coming out of Chicago, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency notified Enbridge more work needs to be done in the Michigan and Kalamazoo River disaster going back to July 2010. Our guest, Rob Fleming, NDP MLA critic, environmental critic, wrote an excellent piece, op-ed piece in The Sun, BC New Democrats firm on pipeline opposition. Now, your leader, who is the putative next premier, he seems to be getting closer as we speak to being the Adrian Dix, has said that when he's the premier, he's going to withdraw BC from this environmental assessment agreement with the federal government. That raises a huge issue about whose coast is it? And a number of writers have written pieces across the country now that this is not a BC coast, it's a Canadian coast. You know, that's the opening to a lot of ours. Tell us about what you're hearing from your leader, from Mr. Dix.
Well, and of course, Premier Christy Clark famously said the coastlines of British Columbia do not belong to British Columbians, so she's of that opinion too.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it would be the taxpayers of British Columbia and the citizens of British Columbia that would live with a catastrophic oil spill and pay for it in terms of billions of dollars. The state of Alaska and citizens there, $11 billion and counting. 25 years later, still a fishery that is in collapse.
I have to ask you again, Rob. You know, we're wonderfully creative, inventive people, human beings. I mean, haven't we built a tanker yet that pretty much can't break apart? Haven't we built a pipeline that can be properly monitored? I mean, how dopey are we?
Well, with a lot of things...
Is there any evidence that we can do that?
With a lot of things, of course, siting is the most important safety factor. I mean, I think as we learned with the Michigan spill, human error is always going to be a factor, and what was dubbed as the Keystone Cops was human negligence at work that had built up over time and become the culture in that control center. But in the North Coast, you're also battling with inclement weather.
Yes.
You know, we just had an earthquake up there as well, so you're on fault lines there. The point is to try and minimize risk to the greatest extent possible. Why Enbridge chose a pipeline route that was through pristine, remote terrestrial territory to then get to a terminal in a place that was deemed unsuitable for 4 decades by the House of Commons and by British Columbia, that's their choice. They submitted this proposal, but what's clear now, David, is that British Columbians, by almost a 3-to-1 margin, do not want the Enbridge Northern Gateway project to proceed. They believe that the environmental risks outweigh any so-called benefits. They believe the benefits are scant, and they expect the province of British Columbia, in the face of a federal government and a prime minister who are so partisanly in favor of this project, to stand up for our interests, to articulate them and stand up for them. And that's something Christy Clark has not done, and Gordon Campbell before her. For 2 years, we have been locked into a process called the Equivalency Agreement, and I know you want to talk about that. But that's the problem right now. We don't have a role or a voice in the final say as to whether that project goes forward or not.
Well, the two leaders, Stephen Harper and Christy Clark, have both made statements that frankly are ludicrous. Mr. Harper, and I'm not one of these people who demonizes Mr. Harper, I think he's actually been a fairly decent prime minister, whether you like him or not, but he's done a reasonably good job.
I might disagree with that, but
I know you would.
I'll go along for now.
But Mr. Harper says, this decision will not be a political one, it'll be a scientific one. Well, just throw that out. I mean, that's comical, that's absurd. Right. And then what does Christy Clark do? She goes and meets Redford in Alberta, and what does she say? Show me the money. I mean, that was her best argument, show me the money? I mean, it's not just about the money.
Well, I think flying to Alberta twice now to have these well-publicized, quote-unquote, frosty short meetings with the Premier there is...
There's a statement.
It's political theater.
Yeah.
If Christy Clark wants British Columbia to reassert control over this process, she can do something very simple. which Adrian Dix has suggested
Yes.
that he would do as Premier. But it's an idea he offers for the current sitting Premier to do in the next 6 months.
Which is to withdraw from that process.
Which is to withdraw from this thing called the equivalency agreement. So
Yes.
what British Columbia did 2 years ago is they signed a deal with Ottawa that said, you do the environmental assessment, whatever you decide, you'll be given a BC environmental certificate. We wipe our hands of this, yours to decide. And that's a problem because it means that we have, in fact, no say. And worse, the problem's been compounded because the Liberal government here in British Columbia, having registered as an intervener, failed to even submit evidence to the National Energy Board, the Joint Review Panel. So we have been extremely passive. We've been missing in action under the BC Liberals for 2 years, and we have no say because we outsourced the decision-making to Ottawa.
It's also an extremely bad situation, a problem, because that's the same federal government that's closing Kitsilano Coast Guard Station, demonstrating that they understand local circumstances not at all.
That's
that,
right.
by the way, is the subject of our show 2 weeks from now.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I mean...
no, there's been all kinds of cuts to marine
some
safety.
Mandarin sitting in an office in Ottawa moving pegs on a board.
Yeah.
Come on.
Well, and also we had a spill response center here that was located on the west coast that was closed. It's now a 1-800 number in Quebec. That's who you're supposed to phone. So this is what's happening in the federal government. The other thing too is in mid-process, Stephen Harper just last spring passed something called Bill C-38 without debate, rammed it through. Something like 60 environmental laws changed. One of them was the act that governs the National Energy Board. If the panel that's looking at Enbridge right now arrives at a conclusion saying we recommend against this project, under the old rules, that was the final say. It died there.
Yes. Now?
Stephen Harper has changed that. They can say no, but he and Cabinet will decide what the final say is. And that will be seen as the culmination of the process. So he has all the cards in his hand. Christy Clark gave them away. And to go and sit down with Alison Redford and try and have this game of poker, well, she's sitting at the wrong card table.
The wrong table. Okay, let's take it out of, just a little bit out of politics for a moment. Craig McGuinness, writing in The Sun, wrote a marvelous piece the other day in which he says, look, there were 3,000 various people on the steps of the ledge, what, a week and a half ago?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. And he says, the problem is that we live in a fossil fuel culture.
Right.
The very synthetic jackets that they are wearing to keep warm and dry come from synthetic fuels.
Right.
Our foods arrive because of fossil fuels. Everything we do, half the things on this table, my glasses, fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
So that's the engine of so much of our lives. What are we supposed to do? He also points out that Kinder Morgan has for years been delivering. They have a pipeline delivering bitumen from Alberta's oil sands to tankers in Vancouver, and we're now talking, as we twin the Port Mann Bridge, we're talking about twinning those lines.
Yeah.
Unless we absolutely stop driving cars, and apparently we're not, because every week there's 2 sections of the Sun called driving.
I understand the argument.
Yeah.
And oil is and will remain important to the global economy for some time to come. And I think the question really that Canadians are hungry for a debate on right now about energy policy is what is the proper pace and scale of the oil sands development in Alberta, not only in terms of carbon pollution and our ability to be amongst the responsible nations that is working to have an international climate agreement, but also in terms of how do we derive the most economic value as Canadians. Peter Lougheed passed away recently, the former Premier of Alberta, and he was a great champion of Canadians using the resources, the natural resources that we're blessed to have, and deriving maximum value out of that. And right now we've got the policy of the Harper government is to get it out of Canada as quickly as possible with as little processing to be done.
This is very interesting.
To new markets, but...
Yeah, to new markets, and I would say largely to China. And it's difficult for me to believe, I wasn't there, I wasn't a fly on the wall, but it's difficult for me to believe that the last 14 times Harper was in China, oil was not discussed.
Oh, of course it was.
It had to be discussed.
I think there's quite a lot of interest there.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that is missing in Canada, too... And
there are new cars and new drivers in China every day.
Mm-hmm. So there is demand there. There's no
Yes.
question about it. But what we're missing, and the National Roundtable on the Economy and the Environment, which Stephen Harper just got rid of, it was a creation of Brian Mulroney, to his credit,
Yes.
said, look, Canada's at risk in the 21st century of being an irrelevant country in terms of the clean technology economy of the future, the trillions of dollars of investment, jobs, and economic activity that Canada could be a leader on. We're missing in action because we're not investing in it, we're downgrading our scientific involvement in it, and we're reliant on an export of bitumen-type policy here in Canada.
I suddenly realized the comic irony of our bicycling mayor. And meanwhile, this huge issue of billions of gallons of crude oil racing across, northern BC.
Right.
Rob, thanks, buddy.
Thanks very much,
Good
David.
stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate
So
it.
we will be repeating a show from a few months ago. My good friend Lorinda Strang, who's the executive director of the Orchard Treatment Center on Bowen Island, and she will give you the real skinny on addictions. Thanks for being with us. DavidBerner.com, the site to go to again. And we thank you for being here with us on Shaw Community Television, Cable 4. Good night.